So welcome everybody to another session of Nystrom Education. Today we are looking at how you lay the foundation for your AP classes using Active Classroom, and our speaker today is Michael Hutchison, which you have probably heard him before if you've been on any of our online courses. Michael is one of our writers. He's done many pieces of work for us. He works and does writing for the Ken Burns series. He'll tell you more about that, I'm sure, and other endeavors as well. So it's always a treat to have Michael on. Participants, you have been muted. We do ask that you use the chat feature so that we can interact with you throughout the session. Michael and I both will watch the chat text and help you in any way that we can. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael. And Michael, thanks again for being here. Take it over.
All righty, Pam. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to prepare our students for advanced placement work by using Active Classroom. And as you can see in the bottom left corner of the screen, I am a teacher at Lincoln High School in Vincennes, Indiana, and I will tell you a little bit more about me in the next slide. But as we go through the session, as Pam mentioned a minute ago, she's already muted everyone's microphone, so you won't be able to actually talk as I am during the session, but you can type questions in the chat window. So if you have questions as we go through the session, please feel free to type those in. Pam and I will monitor the chat area and we'll answer questions as I see them. And I'll also have some time at the end of the session to answer questions that you might have about, what we speak about this afternoon and so forth. We've already actually done the last part of this, which is for all of us to type in our geographic area, what we teach. So I will just tell you very quickly about me. If you look at the next slide, that is me. I am Social Studies Department Chair at Lincoln High School in Vincennes, Indiana. If you're familiar with the geography of the Midwest, we're located roughly about 5 hours by car south of Chicago, about 3.5 to 4 hours east of St. Louis, about 3 hours west of Louisville and Cincinnati. So we're kind of right in the middle of the heartland. And as Pam mentioned, I've been a curriculum contributor for PBS and Social Studies School Service for some time, as well as for C-SPAN and some other groups. So right now I'm in the middle of, actually we just begun doing curriculum for the Ken Burns Vietnam War series, which airs in September. So I'm really looking forward to that. It'll be a really great opportunity to investigate the war more, and if you've ever had any opportunity to see any of Ken's films, such as the Civil War or Horatio's Drive or baseball, the National Park series, you know how great of a documentary filmmaker he is. I'm also past president of the Indiana Computer Educators, which is the state affiliate for the International Society for Technology and Education. And I'm also a certified active classroom and strategic facilitator for Social Studies School Service and Nystrom Education. So I haven't had a chance to visit North Carolina or Georgia as far as anything related to those things yet, but maybe at some point I will. I've driven through Georgia and I've driven through North Carolina, but haven't had a whole lot of time, unfortunately, to spend in either one of those great states. So I thought we'd start this afternoon by just talking about a little bit about what AP is. And if you're teaching AP classes now, you probably already know a little bit about this, more probably as much as I do. I noticed Charlton's joined us. So Charlton, if you'd like to take a minute and just type in the text box where you're located geographically and the subject areas you teach, we would certainly appreciate that. A caveat before we begin, I do not technically teach AP courses. I teach dual credit courses. We've entered into an agreement with our local junior college where we provide college credit at a greatly reduced rate, but our students generally do not take the AP exam. So I teach an AP government class, at this point in time. So those students, if they successfully pass government with a C or better, then what happens is they get 3 hours of college credit through our local junior college. I also noticed that Bill has joined us this afternoon. Bill, if you would type in your geographic area where you're located and also the subject area you teach, we'd appreciate that. We're just getting to know each other a little bit now. So AP really began the same year I did, which is 1955. I'm currently at the end of my 38th year of classroom teaching, so I'm getting close to 62 years of age. So it's around the same, so it's about 62 years old. And the main purpose of AP was that at that time, the fear was just as similar to everything else in the Cold War, that the Russians were, they were achieving us as far as things like whether it was engineering, science, putting a man in space or whatever. But just in general, the education system of the United States compared to that of the Soviet Union, that we really weren't doing as much as we could to get high school kids ready for college coursework. So the AP program was actually created to provide a curriculum that would make the transition from high school to college easier, so that we could get kids into schools and we could get them primarily, I guess, in the education fields of engineering, science, and math. Today, nearly 19,000 high schools across the country and 5,000 colleges around the country participate in the AP program. And there are AP tests that are available in nearly 32 subject areas. So there is an AP exam for U.S. history, which I teach, although we don't need it, we don't use it because our situation is a little different. And also in AP government, which is another subject that I teach, that again is not really something that students take the AP course for, or AP test for, but I do give college credit for that. So technically, when my students enter the classroom for the first day, the first thing I always tell them is, welcome to Vincennes University, which is the junior college locally. So at that time, I am not a high school teacher. I am now a university instructor. So I teach them a little differently than you might do with a normal AP test. But I'll give you some examples in just a moment of things that I do use, which are definitely something that would get kids ready for the AP exam. So let's talk a little bit just very quickly about what the normal AP test would include. So I'm looking at American history because that's my major area, although I do teach government as well. I'm also licensed in world history, but we don't offer AP on the world history level. At least I don't teach it. We do have another teacher that teaches it though. So the exam generally includes most of the following. So there's multiple choice questions, approximately 55 questions, which would be about 40% or about 4/10 of the exam score. There are also some short answer questions. There are usually 4 questions on the exam. You could probably do a Google search very easily and see past AP tests. So if you wanted to get a feeling specifically for what they ask as far as document-based questions or long essay questions or whatever, definitely they're there. The document-based questions, which I'll mention a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. There's usually one question, and it's 25% of the exam score. I have written some curriculum for Social Studies School Service, which is not available at this time on Active Classroom, that deals with how to answer the AP questions. So they're actually practice questions on about any area, any level, or whatever that you could think about that would be offered as a U.S. history curriculum. And then there's also a long essay question at the end, which provides a view as far as some comprehensive information about that particular period in U.S. history, and that's 15% of the score. So as you can see from just looking at this slide, roughly about 60% of the AP exam will deal with either short answer, a document-based question or a long essay question. So what we want to focus on is what can Active Classroom really do to provide a way to prep those students to take the AP exam. So let's take a minute and look at Active Classroom activities that will help base AP skill or build AP skills, excuse me. So the ones that I focused on for our discussion this afternoon, and this is primarily because of some things that I use and I do. Many AC programs, and an AC of course refers to Active Classroom, refers or asks students to analyze a particular text and photographs, as well as completing a writing exercise such as a document-based question. So it's generally an open-ended question where the students would look at a particular resource or group of resources, and then they would use the information that they were able to develop from that source, as well as their own knowledge of American history in this instance, and then they would make a conclusion and write an answer to the DBQ. Now, there are some major differences between Active Classroom and most AP tests, because what we ask them to do in Active Classroom activities primarily is to look at a specific image or a specific document and then submit an answer. So we ask them to do a couple of things. We ask them to look at that individual image or that individual document, reflect on that, answer a question based on that, and then go back and look at all of the documents together to answer the document-based question. So what I want to focus on this afternoon is that using Active Classroom activities will definitely help students develop and practice skills that are critical to the success in AP courses and the AP exam. So what I'm also suggesting here is I use Active Classroom for my regular, or what I call my meat and taters, U.S. history and government classes, but I also use it for my AP classes. And the reason why I do is because I can adapt that, or I can pick specific activities and specific ideas that focus more on something that would be related to dual credit, or focus more that might be on something that would relate to the idea of an AP exam question, and then that way that preps those students for that. So again, I just want to take a moment before I move to the next slide to remind everybody that certainly Pam and I welcome your questions or comments as you want to make them as we go through the session today. Please feel free to type those in the chat area at the right of your screen, and we will answer those either during the session itself, or we'll try and answer them at the end of the session before we call today. So let's talk a little bit about some specific activities that I believe will help build AP skills. And the ones I've selected today were the Historian's Apprentice, Debating the Documents, Document-Based Activities, which are an older set of activities, but I still use them frequently in the classroom. And one of the reasons why is because I'm the author of several of them. Government Activators, which a good friend of mine by the name of Greg Timmons wrote, which are really very interesting hands-on activity-based activities that can help with collaborative thinking and analyzation of ideas and integration of those skills and so forth. Now, there are many other activities in areas that frankly I don't teach, and those include economics, world history, and geography, that if you teach those areas and you're looking for things that might be based on something that you might want to use for AP, I would certainly do some searching in Active Classroom and just find some of those. Later on this summer, I believe, Pam, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but psychology also becomes an asset that becomes available in Active Classroom, and certainly you know, there'll be activities there. I'm not licensed to teach econ, so I just can't tell you specifically because it's not an area that I use very often. what's available in that. I have done some work in world history, and a lot of the same materials like Historian's Apprentice and debating the documents and the document-based activities are available for world history as well as for U.S. history. And I've gone through some of the geography activities, and certainly some of the things related there are definitely things that might be usable for you and your classes. So let's kind of focus on some of these individually, and we'll talk a little bit about individual activities and what we can use in those as far as for developing AP skills. So the first one I want to talk about is the Historian's Apprentice. And because I'm an American history teacher, I picked something that actually some of my students are working on right now, or at least the period, and that is the Depression and the New Deal. And this one focuses on FDR and the first 100 days. So if you're familiar, if you're a U.S. history teacher, you probably cover quite a bit of this already as far as the causes of the Depression, what Roosevelt did in his first 3 months in office to try and stop the problems of the Depression, and just basically to get the country back on track. So there are some specific things that I want to focus on with you this afternoon with this. Okay, so this is a typical, what I did was a screenshot of a typical screen that you would see in an active classroom for a typical Historian's Apprentice activity. So the first thing I want to point to you this afternoon, even though my arrow didn't quite go right to it, that most active classroom projects and activities have a comprehensive teacher's guide, which is downloadable. Now, I use these quite frequently just so I have a print reference of a particular project or a particular activity, so I can see it in hard copy. Of course, I have active classroom access anywhere I go with a laptop or a desktop and internet access. But sometimes I just like to have a hard copy of the resources so I can view them, not on a screen, but just on a piece of paper at my leisure, and I can get an idea of exactly what it is I'm looking for, how do I want to plan this out, or if you're in a situation where you don't have a one-to-one situation. For example, we are one-to-one with Chromebooks with our freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, and we are one-to-one with iPads for our seniors. So if you're in a situation where you're not one-to-one, you could certainly just print out the teacher's guide and Xerox copies as needed. So the teacher's guide is very, very essential to this. It gives you, as the teacher, lesson plan tips, different ideas about how to utilize this program in the classroom, all kinds of different information, which is very, very good for you to use. You'll also notice there is a PowerPoint presentation. This PowerPoint presentation focuses on the 5 patterns of historians, and it also goes into a little bit about FDR in the first 100 days, which, as you probably know, dealt a lot with things like the bank holiday, things like make work projects for people, so you can see the public works, different things along that line. The idea of the stock market crash and that sort of thing. So there's also, as you can tell, vocabulary, which is good because we want our students to be able to understand the different ideas and different theories and different things that happen that we want to talk about during our lecture or whatever. And certainly the idea of knowing what these terms mean is an important part of it. So the vocabulary is essential. And then there are also several primary historic documents. And so each one of the Historian's Apprentice activities comes with 10 document analysis, which is key to what we want to do in an AP course. We want to be able to have our students look at documents, whether they're text-based or they're image-based, and we want them to be able to analyze those documents. So for the just for the sheer breadth of this, I don't really have time this afternoon to show you individual primary sources, I would highly encourage you on your own time to look at some of the primary sources that are located here. I'm going to show you one in particular in just a second that I liked, but each one of the questions, each one of the sources has separate analysis questions. So I can't show you all 10, but I can show you one of them. So let's take just a minute and look at this first primary source. And as you can tell, first of all, it's actually marked as a primary historic source, but as you can tell, this comes from FDR's first inaugural address. So I'm looking at this very small clip right here. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. And then it goes on to say, I won't read the whole thing to you, but plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. So what we want students to do here is we want students to analyze those 3 paragraphs from Franklin Roosevelt's inaugural address. So as you can tell, the first question asks, who created this primary source? What audience do you think it was created for? And why is this sourcing information especially important in understanding the speech and its importance? So that's a fairly open-ended question. So obviously most students are going to say, who created this primary source? Well, it's easy, that's Franklin D. Roosevelt. What audience do you think it was created for? Most students might say, oh, it's simply the people of the country that were listening to his speech on the radio. Why is this sourcing information especially important in understanding this speech and its importance? Now the student has to kind of look at that a little bit, and they have to say, well, why is this important? What is it about this speech that Roosevelt felt it was important to give it and important to make those specific quotes that he did? And certainly what you and I probably know from the idea that, we studied this coursework in college and so on, is we probably know that, obviously this was a speech that was meant to instill confidence in the American people, that, we know that our students are, maybe not as aware of, the idea of what an inaugural address does as far as maybe compared to what we know. Certainly I can remember inaugural addresses all the way back to John F. Kennedy. And so, maybe an extension activity of this might be to say, okay, find a copy of President Trump's inaugural address. How does that speech compare and contrast to these? And we can certainly find some interesting answers to that. So let's go on ahead and we'll talk a little bit about some other parts of this analysis. So we want to know, what do students know, which is again a very important part of what you'll see in a DBQ in a AP test. About what do you know about the 1920s and 1930s to explain what FDR is saying here. So it's not really something they can go back and look at that speech quote and say, this is exactly what he meant. But what skills, what information do I know about with the 1920s and the 1930s? What do I know about the stock market crash? What do I know about what President Hoover tried to do to solve the problems of the Depression? Or whatever, what do I know that can answer this question? So hopefully our students would have already done analysis. They would have done some things, in terms of what did I learn in the last unit on the 1920s? What did I learn about the stock market crash? That helps them answer this question. So the AP test will do a very similar thing. They will ask the student, what can you see from these documents, but what do you know about your knowledge of American history prior to this? So it's not just what did you read in the last 2 or 3 paragraphs, what do you know? So this is a good example of how students can be, kind of primed for that information. And some other things, we want students to interpret the meanings of different things. And I like number 5 in particular. Why do you think this sentence has become so famous over the years since the Great Depression? You know, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so, you know, what I always tell my students, and probably what you tell yours, is, well, we want students to be able to understand that the Depression was psychological as well as it was economic. And what Roosevelt had to do was he had to get the country thinking positively that the Depression was, sure, it was a bad thing, but the Depression was also something that could be beaten, that if we work together, if we put our minds to it, we could easily defeat the Depression, or at least somewhat easily. So let's look at some other things that Historian's Apprentice will allow us to do. Not only are there primary sources, there are also secondary sources, and I'm sure probably you know this already, and I am not telling you something you don't already know, but just in case when people read this or they see the transcript or they see it on YouTube, they may not know. A primary historic source excuse me, is one that comes direct from the past. So like, for example, the Zapruder film was a primary source. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is a primary source. On the other hand, a secondary source is one that doesn't come direct from the past, but it is one that a student can look at with just as much, you know, what I would say, objectivity, or is just as reliable a source as a primary source. So I did not live during the Great Depression, so I can't tell you specifically what it was like to listen to FDR on the radio because I wasn't alive in 1933. However, I could be a secondary source. I could tell you or tell my students, this is what FDR said. This is what FDR meant. And so the Historian's Apprentice series relies on secondary sources as well as primary sources. So what we want to do here is just look at those secondary sources, and of course one thing that I really like with this page is it talks about that no interpretation or no account of the past is absolutely 100% neutral. I suppose based on my frame of reference, you know, I was a child of the 60s, that, you know, I mean, the sun rose and set on John F. Kennedy. On the other hand, Lyndon Johnson got us in the Vietnam War, so I kind of have some feelings about him, that he was always sort of a pretender to the throne after JFK died, and that if John F. Kennedy had lived, you know, so that never would have happened. So, I mean, it's very difficult for students not to have feelings one way or another. However, what we want to do is we want them to look at what they feel, but look at those sources in an objective way, so that they can see both sides of the issue. So here's an example of a secondary source question. So we're looking at two different books here. We're looking at H.W. Brand's Traitor to His Class and The Forgotten Man by Amity Shlaes. And what we're doing is we're asking the students to consider secondary sources, but to find primary sources that back up Brand's interpretation of Roosevelt's 100 Days. So I don't specifically have the passages there just for the brevity of time, but if you want to look at this activity, you can go to Active Classroom, you know, at any time you'd like, and look at what Brand said and look at what Amity Shlaes said, and then you can get an idea of those. Then the second question is, from this lesson, choose two primary sources that back Amity Shlaes' interpretation. So they're looking at primary sources and secondary sources, and they are making conclusions on those based on what they know with the primary sources. So what are we doing? We're analyzing sources. We're making conclusions based on those sources, which is exactly what the AP exam wants us to do, wants our students to do. So if you have ever taken an AP exam, and maybe some of you have, you probably can commiserate with that very easily. This is exactly what you did when you were 17 or 18 years old and you took the U.S. History AP exam, or the U.S. History, or excuse me, the AP Government exam. So those are things that are probably very familiar to you. Okay, the next series I want to talk about is one that I really like, and I use this one very often in my classroom, which is Debating the Documents. And this is a series that's available for both world history and also U.S. history. I picked a world history topic here just simply because when I put together my PowerPoint for this, I didn't know exactly what my audience would be. I didn't know if you would be primarily world history teachers, primarily U.S. history teachers, and I wanted the U.S. history and the world history to at least get equal time. So as you can tell, this is a Debating the Documents activity, the impact of the printing press in China and in Europe. So let's take a minute and look at some of the different assets that are available in this that you can use in your classroom. Just like with the Historian's Apprentice, there is a comprehensive teacher's guide. And the teacher's guide gives you strategies, ideas, even how to structure your lesson plans if you wanted to do this on a 3-day course of study, 5-day, less or more. So it gives you strategies. I don't know what it's like in Georgia or North Carolina, but in Indiana, we are on a pretty strict timeline as far as, we have a 180-day school year. We have a number of days where we have students out on field trips and so forth. We do have state standardized testing as far as into the sophomore year of high school. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get everything done that we want to do. So this is a good opportunity if you want to adapt what you're doing here for something, if you want to do something that's a little bit more structured, a little bit less structured, then you definitely have the opportunity to do it. You'll also notice that one thing that Debating the Documents includes suggestions to the student. So this does give a framework to your students about how they should best use this. So I didn't put the entire thing there, but because I didn't have enough room on the slide, but how do you use a primary source? What is a primary source? So it gives you basic background about these two different groups of sources, and the sources conflict with one another. In other words, some of the sources may promote one viewpoint, the other sources promote an entirely different viewpoint. So so again, this is where the Debating the Documents comes from, because some of these students may say, oh, I think document 1 and 2 are by far the better documents for a historian to use. Documents 3 and 4 are better, maybe another student might say. So you could have a classroom discussion or a debate on that. Also, in addition to visual sources, there are written historic sources. So we'll take a minute and look at some of those in the next slide or so. Now, at the end of the lesson, students are invited, or I guess in our case they're assigned, to write an answer to a document-based question. So what we want students to do, and sometimes, to be perfectly honest with you, it's sort of difficult to get my high school juniors to understand this, that they're supposed to use the documents in order to specifically answer the question. In my dual credit course, what I want students to do is I want them to analyze the question, but I want them to specifically cite the evidence, the written sources, the visual sources, whatever it is. And so in this case, there are two document-based questions. Question number 1 says, the inventing of the printing press using movable type was a truly revolutionary development. Do you agree or disagree? Now, what the teacher can do here is also assign a second document-based question. They could assign number 1 or assign number 2. So the second question is, analyze the impact of the printing press and movable type on Europe and China. Based on your analysis, explain why you do or do not think this technological innovation by itself can be described as revolutionary. What I suggested is that if we're teaching an AP class and we want students to have a little bit more rigorous work compared to what we might want by them taking a meat and taters U.S. history class, is we might want to assign both, or at least revise some of these. I mean, they basically asked a very similar question, but the second question kind of focuses on both Europe and China. So, you know, it's just revolutionary. So I guess students would have to have some background in what a revolutionary means, what the word means. You know, Pam says perhaps let the students choose. Now that might also be a good idea. Hopefully our students would see that, you know, there's challenges in both questions, and there's definitely things that might make, you know, answering one question a little bit easier than the other. Now, when the students are ready to write their essay, in other words, write the answer to their document-based question, you'll also notice that there are checklists of key suggestions, things that students want to do before, you know, as far as answering the question. So, for example, for the introductory paragraph, what I always tell my students is that, they are the reporters, and say they're writing for a newspaper or whatever. Okay, okay, thanks, Pam. They are, you know, writing something, and I'm the audience, so they have to hook me. So this is a good way to, kind of get them thinking about what's the best way to answer the question. Of course, I want them to use the evidence. I want them to cite the evidence, which is what we want in an AP class. Another group of activities that I'm especially fond of are the document-based activities. A caveat here, I wrote several of these, including the one that we're going to look at right now, which is one about Johnny Reb and Billy Yank in the Civil War. So what I did here was I put primary sources together of 2 Civil War soldiers. One is a Union soldier by the name of Daniel Crotty. The other one is a Civil War soldier by the name of Sam Watkins, who was a Confederate soldier. And again, if you have seen the Ken Burns series on the Civil War, Sam Watkins is featured prominently in that. So what the students do is they read primary sources. In this instance, they're reading sources from Crotty's diary, and then they answer questions based on what they see. So here are some of the questions. Describe the daily routine, scroll to the account of winter in camp, which again I don't have enough space on my slide to do, drawing rations and army cooking. So there's all kinds of different things here. So the kids can, kind of compare and contrast, they can interpret. So these are things that I think are things that we really want our kids to understand and do. So let's shift gears from American history and world history, and let's talk a little bit about government activators. With government activators, and I selected just one, the executive branch, like many other things that I've spoken with you about this afternoon, there's a comprehensive teacher's guide. I always copy the teacher's guide and have it in advance, just mainly so I have a copy, I can read it on my leisure, I don't have to be in front of a computer screen. I usually assign these electronically to students. Every government activator begins with a historical background essay. So students learn, very similar to what they might see in a textbook, what we want them to know. In this case, what do we want them to know about the executive branch of government? Once they're done with that, there's a graphic organizer in which they use critical thinking skills, again, another AP skill, in order to understand about things like why did the framers develop an electoral college? What does the executive branch do to ensure or to fulfill different powers or whatever that are in the preamble? So to be honest, sometimes even in my AP government classes, I have some problems with this because the kids don't understand, well, I know what it says in the preamble, but what do I want to look at here? And of course, what I always refer them to is Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. In our case, we use Google Classroom, so I can post any assignment I want online. So I actually post a copy of Article 2, Section 2, so the student can actually look at those and say, oh yeah, now I know what established justice is all about, or a more perfect union. But with these, kids do have to kind of dig a little bit. What do they mean by a more perfect union? What does the executive branch do for that? And then at the end of each government activator, there is a project. Again, I don't have enough space on this that I can show you the entire project, but what students do in this is they look at things online, the president in the news. They look at news stories about what is President Trump doing today, what role does the president fulfill, different things like that, and then they work together in groups to create a poster that kind of highlights that. I had my students do this just a couple of months ago, and we had a lot of fun doing it. It was right at the beginning of the Trump administration, so at that point they were looking at things like the wall, they were looking at things like the travel ban, repealing Obamacare, and then there's a number of different things there that they can do with this. They make posters and all kinds of things. So I'm about at the end of my time this afternoon, but let's sum up a little bit on some things that we found out today. First of all, there are several great activities in Active Classroom that can help prepare your students for AP coursework. In my case, I actually use them for dual credit students, and like I said, my situation is a little different, but I believe that even though my kids don't take an AP test, what they do also would help them develop those skills that they would need for the short answer or for the long essay or for the document-based questions. So some of the activities that we spoke about this afternoon: the Historian's Apprentice, debating the documents, document-based activities, and again, these are all available for world history and U.S. history, and government activators. I am sure if you are an econ teacher and you want to do this for econ, you could find econ activities, and the reason why I did not include them basically was for time. And also just mainly because I'm not an econ teacher. So if you are an econ teacher, I would strongly encourage you to just take some time as you have it and just look at different things that are available that might be there for econ, or as Pam mentioned before, psychology or sociology. These activities provide opportunity for writing, document comparison, document analysis, and for collaborative learning. We don't necessarily do collaborative learning, on an AP test, but the idea of students looking at other students' activities or views or whatever, making conclusions on those, I believe is a pivotal part of it. And then, as I mentioned, there are other activities that might be used to prepare students in various subject areas. So what I would suggest that you do is just as you have time, maybe the rest of the school year, or possibly during the summer, as you think about what you're going to do with your courses next school year, just take some time and just play around with Active Classroom and see what's there. There's definitely a great resource, a lot of different materials, whether it's big eras or the What We Eat series as far as geography, or any number of things that would definitely be advantageous to use. There's a lot more there than we could do in one class setting for sure.